Greetings, it's I, Tempest Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the EARTHDAWN Roleplaying game system, where I go over all the information about this interesting role-playing games world and its systems. In the previous episode, we were talking, of course, about combat. Today, we're going to continue with some more information about combat. So we were talking about getting injured and wounded last time. Now, no matter how much damage a character has taken, it has no true effect on the way that your character acts. The exception to this would be wounds. For one thing, a wound will interfere with your ability to recover. For every wound you have received, when you are making a recovery test, you will subtract 1 from your result from the amount of wounds you have. So you make your recovery test, whatever the results are, you subtract the amount of wounds you have, and that's how much you actually heal. Now, it is important to note, no matter how badly you roll, a 1 is the minimum you will still heal with a recovery test once you're subtracting wounds. So, amount of wounds that I'm subtracting from my recovery can't go below 1. I can still recover a little bit. Now, I'm going to talk about something which is technically not an optional rule, but it is something you might want to wait to actually enact in your game. The fact is that as you are a game master that's a beginner, or you have a lot of players at the beginner, you don't want to push them too much. They should know the basics of combat first. What can happen is that wounds will interfere with other checks. Effectively speaking, this, again, not optional, but you could wait to implement it. The first wound has no effect, but every wound after the first has a cumulative -1 to all of your action and effects tests. So if I had 3 wounds, I'd have -2 to all my action and effect tests. Now, it is important to note there is an exception to this, though: recovery tests. Recovery tests, you still subtract the amount of wounds to the results, but they don't have any other kind of ill effects to your recovery test based on it. It's just that. Now, wounds are difficult to recover, but you can recover from them. You can recover at a rate of about 1 wound per day, but there are some requirements, some things that you have to meet in order to heal that 1 wound. First off, you cannot take damage in the course of that day. This includes damage from something like strain. Any site of damage that would be dealt to you will negate your ability to heal this wound. You also have to have the ability that at the end of your night, at the end of your rest, to spend a recovery test. So, just like when we were talking about when you had to spend your recovery tests, you have to have one available and be able to do it at this point in time. It's important to also note, though, that there are some curses and magical effects which could cause you to not be able to use recovery tests. Then you really can't heal wounds. But it is also important to note, in retrospect to that, there are some healing aids and spells themselves which can cause wounds to be healed, including some talents too. So there are ways that wounds can become a little bit more permanent if you're cursed or something, but there is also magic and other healing aids which might be able to assist you in it. So there is a balancing effect rather than just possibly resting over many, many days if you get many, many wounds. Though you still might have to actually do that. Alright, let's talk about combat options, because I talked a little bit about what combat options were before, just talking about that they existed. A combat option is a special option you can use for your character. You declare a combat action before you roll your initiative test on the course of a turn. So every time before you start your initiative test, you can choose to use one of these combat options to gain yourselves an amount of advantages and disadvantages, because each one does indeed have advantages and disadvantages. Some of these can only be used with range attacks. Others you have to use in close quarters combat. Regardless, though, it is important to note that much like when I was talking about it before, part of those wounds, these are again something which is to a degree optional. It's not really truly optional. They're still there, but much like before, you might want to wait until you are more developed and more familiar with the combat system before you implement combat options. And this is again both as the game master and players. Once you're ready for them, add in your combat options. Up until then, you are free to ignore them. It is very important to note that you normally can't use more than 1 combat option in a round. Most normal rules. So if something says it's an exception and it will allow you to use more than 1, then it is saying itself is an exception. Other than that, assume 1. Also, if you start your turn prone, knocked down, you can't use a combat option. You have to be standing and ready to use it in order to use the combat option. Now, the book lists a good number of combat options. I am not going to go into details about them. Just like I didn't go into details about talents and skills and spells, I'm just giving you the fact that they exist, and each one will give a number of disadvantages and advantages to you in combat. If you want to look through them and see what kind of combat options there are, go ahead. Remember, you want to be familiar with combat before you start looking at these and deciding ones that you want to use. So get yourself secured in combat, then come back to the book and start looking at combat options. Wait until you're good and ready. Now, adventurers, legends, they make their way in the world going on little adventures, using their talents and skills to overcome troubles, to find and discover new places, to do many different things that are all both adventurous and legendary. The very fact is that the basics of combat aren't the only thing you're going to have to worry about. The fact is there are situations which can alter how combat is going. Something that might have been an easy fight in any other circumstance, a change in those circumstances could make it that it's in this easy creature's favor, and now you're having a difficult fight. Or something that's very difficult. If you find yourself in an advantageous situation, you might be able to eat it. You might be able to beat it like that. The fact is, circumstances can be both a blessing to a player or a curse to them. The circumstances, as they alter, will change how your action tests are and how your damage tests. Depending on the circumstances, depends on how it will alter it, and either grant you a boost or grant you a penalty in many of these circumstances. But that's it for today. So, I first finished talking about wounds. I talked about what kind of effects a wound will have on you. The fact that it will definitely cause you some trouble. Recovering from it's difficult. It takes time to recover from it. And when you're good and ready, apply some penalties to your character from them too, because you're supposed to technically do that. Now, I didn't handle a few optional rules here, including bleeding. So if you wish to add in a few other more complex optional rules, there is optional rules for bleeding within the book. Go ahead as the game master and take a look at them and consider when you're using optional rules. I'm not trying to dive into optional rules. I'm letting you know they're there. Go ahead and use them as you need them. But then I moved on and I talked about combat options, which are special options you choose before you roll your initiative, which you can only have one a turn. You're not really going to be changing this. You're stuck with your combat option. We talked about this. Even if you can change the declared action you have, your combat option you took is there, which have strengths and weaknesses of their own, and similar to those penalties that you get to, well, most of your rolls when you have wounds, which are not really optional, but you can wait to use them. Combat options, not really optional, but you can wait to use them until players are good and ready to use them. Then, go ahead and throw combat options in. Then I started talking about, of course, combat modifiers, things that are going to alter you, situational modifiers that are going to affect the way that your character does battle, either for the better or for the worse. In the next episode, this is one I will be going over. Unlike a lot of those other things before, where you're making a lot of choices, these are important enough that I feel like most of these modifiers I will be diving into and letting you know about them, because most of these are fairly common that they can come up. So of course, it's good to know about them. So we will dive into situational modifiers actually next time. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you would say, anything you think I left out, please leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It shows support the channel, the empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon, link description below. There's some great rewards there. It helps to grow and improve the empire and the channel. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.